When I initially started to make this game, I didn't have an idea in mind, so to help me come up with an idea, I tried to come up with a few things that I definitely wanted in my game. Here are the things I started with. Fantasy setting, so think swords, monsters, magic. Fast gameplay, so it's going to be a hack and slash sort of game, so no turn-based or anything like that. Unique runs, I wanted each playthrough to feel different, and when you die and you play again, it'll feel different than the last. Easy to learn and understand, but not an easy game. So I wanted it to be like if you were watching someone else play this game, you'd know instantly how the game was played and how you win, but that doesn't necessarily mean it's an easy game to play. So I'm going to have things like permadeath. So permadeath is when you die, you lose your progress and you have to start over. Pixel art, so I'm terrible at pretty much every sort of art, so I'm going to go with pixel art. And it's going to have minimal animations and art because I suck at both of those things. So wherever possible, I'm going to try and keep it as minimal as possible. So here's what I came up with. I'm thinking of a top-down hack and slash game where you play as this little guy in the center of the screen as you journey through a procedurally generated dungeon, finding the doorway to the level below, fighting off monsters and picking up weapons as you go until you reach the bottom floor. Reach the bottom floor and kill the last boss and win the game, maybe? I haven't actually finalized that last bit. It's a super simple idea, but we can always add to it later to make things more interesting, but for now I think it's a good place to start. So let's start making the game. I'm using Game Maker Studio 2 for this game, as it'll be a 2D game from a top-down perspective, and I'm more comfortable with working with 2D in Game Maker rather than using something like Unity for 2D. If this was a 3D game, certainly some aspects would be easier, but I'm more comfortable with 2D. Firstly, I set up the project and added some basic movement. Here we can see our player moving around from a top-down perspective, so what we're seeing is the top of the character's head. The player right now is just this simple circle. This is a hack and slash game, so I added some basic enemies, and the player can now shoot out a fireball. The enemies have a turn speed. They can't just instantly turn towards the player and start moving. They first must turn towards the player, then start moving. Right now I have it set up so that when the fireball hits the enemy, the direction of the enemy is reversed. This means that the enemy then has to turn all the way back around before coming back to the player. I mainly just added this as some feedback to know when the enemies were being hit by the attack, but it gives a cool, almost knockback effect. The turn speed also gives the enemies a lifelike feel. Next, I made it so that enemies take damage from the fireball. So the fireball deals 1 damage and the enemies have 3 health, so 3 hits and they're destroyed. There's not much feedback yet, but they just disappear, but we can add that later. Okay, so I've changed the way the player looks. The circle made it hard to know which direction the player was facing. This new shape is meant to be the head and shoulders of the player with the fireball shooting out from in front, but I can still work on this in the future. We have a ranged attack in the fireball, so next up was melee weapons. What you're seeing here is the player hitting back enemies with a melee weapon. There's no weapon yet, it's just the hitbox, which is created in front of the player. Just for a few frames, then it's destroyed. Any enemies that get hit by the hitbox have their direction reversed, just like before. Melee hitboxes, unlike ranged, don't destroy themselves after hitting an enemy, which means that they can hit multiple enemies at once. To add some feedback to the hits, I've made the enemies flash white when they get hit, and they go from full white when hit and then slowly fade back to their usual color over a second or two. Next up is knockback, a simple force added to the enemies in the opposite direction from themselves to the player to push them away. For added feedback, I've added some slight shake to the enemies when they're hit and some shake to the camera as well. So I wanted the levels to be randomly generated and for each playthrough to feel different. To add to this, I've set up the camera angle to be random each time the level is generated. As you can see here, this can make even the same level feel a bit different each time, just because we're seeing it from a different angle. Still no collisions, so let's add those. After a bug of the player teleporting into walls, we now have this nice smooth collision with walls, for the player anyway. Enemies are still warping around and they can push you into walls and softlock the game apparently, so let's try and fix that. There we go, smooth player and enemy collisions with walls, and I've also added a small bounce when they're hit, as I felt that the immediate stop felt a bit off. When enemies and players run into walls, they'd immediately stop, so that felt a bit strange to me. So I've added a small bounce. I think what's great about this is you can now see the game coming together. For the most part, this is the core of the gameplay. It's going to be you hitting monsters, slashing, and avoiding them. I've also added turn speed to the player now, just like enemies. The player has to turn towards the mouse rather than just always looking at it. This is a value that's going to need constant iteration of the development process, as it really changes how the character feels. Do I want fast responsive controls with a fast player turn rate, or do I want a more weighty character that feels more grounded in the world with a slower turn rate? So maybe a balance between the two. Now that I have walls, we can make levels, so let's create some random levels. Here you see my first attempt at some levels. I'm using a basic walker style generation. When the generator walks a set distance, then it turns all the time placing down floor tiles. I'm happy with how something so simple can create pretty complex levels. Getting sidetracked again, I've also made it so that instead of the camera following the player exactly, it now follows a point between the player and the camera. This makes the game feel a bit more dynamic, as if the player is peering off into the distance if the mouse is moved far away. Back to the levels, I now have walls and floors implemented. You can see the types of levels that can be created with such a simple method are really cool, and they offer lots of variety. These levels are looking good, but there's no sense of exploration or mystery to them, so I wanted to add some shadows. This shader casts out shadows from the walls we've previously added. Here in this test room, you can see the pseudo 3D effect that they give off. Creating these shadows is rather intensive on the FPS, so I've limited it to only create shadows on the walls inside of the yellow box and ignore the ones on the outside. I'll stretch this box out to be larger than what the camera can see, but I've left it here so that you can see how it works. I've called these shadows in my code, but to be honest, they're more like walls if anything. What's great is how they limit the player's view, so each corner and the things behind the corner are unknown. It certainly adds to the tension of the levels. I don't know if this turn leads to a small dead end or a large opening. Each corner of the level will need to be searched, or you might miss weapons, enemies, or loot. The game is feeling more detailed, so I've added a bit more detail to the player's appearance. I've changed the player from the white blob we had before to now a more detailed view of a top-down of a character with little legs that show up when the character's moving. I've also started settling into a visual style for the game. I've adjusted the colors of the floor and used a more drab tone with the player, nothing overly bright or colorful. And that's the game so far. Next time I'd like to add different weapon types, but I'll need to have a think about how I want to implement that. If you've made it this far, thank you very much for watching. Please subscribe and turn on notifications if you haven't already to catch the next episode of the Devlog series. If you have any comments or suggestions for the game, please leave them below and I will read all of them. Thanks.